after the king was dead. Well, by this point, the leaders of the French Revolution were what we might call extreme left-wingers. They wanted France to adopt a radical new political system that rejected all forms of hierarchy in favor of collective leadership and consensus-based decision-making. So instead of having one single ruler making all of the big decisions, everything would instead be done by a bunch of committees appointed by Parliament. Everyone on the committees would be equal, all decisions would be made collectively, and membership of the committees would change every month. At first, the highest ranking committee was the Executive Council, which was comprised of 6 men. But then in 1793, it was decided that they needed a new, stronger committee to get a handle on all of the war and violence that had been engulfing French society in the aftermath of the Revolution. So they created a new committee of 12 men called the Committee for Public Safety. The Committee for Public Safety wasn't actually around for that long, less than 2 years. But today, it is remembered as being one of the worst forms of government France ever had, because of its role in overseeing what was known as the terror portion of the revolution. This was the period in which any French person who was suspected of being counter-revolutionary was rounded up and, with the guillotine. They say nearly 40,000 people in all were killed. A guy named Maximilien Robespierre is usually described as being the lead tyrant of the Public Safety Committee, even though he didn't technically hold any position that put him above anyone else. But any system without a formal hierarchy will usually just wind up with the person with the most aggressive personality calling the shots, or Blade. Anyway, after that disaster, in 1795, they got rid of the Public Safety Committee and replaced it with something called the Executive Directory, which was a much less powerful committee of 5 men who rotated every year. And then in 1799, a military general named Napoleon Bonaparte staged a coup and overthrew them. Now, Napoleon was a big shot military hero who a lot of people respected for his leadership skills, but even he was loyal to the principles of the revolution, and so when he first took power, he continued to respect the rule by committee system, but his committee was only 3 people rather than 5. But then in 1802, Napoleon was like, to hell with this, I should be permanent chairman of the committee for life. And then 2 years after that, he was like, I should actually be emperor of all of France. And so that's what happened. They had a big coronation and everything. Napoleon hung around as Emperor of France for 10 years, during which time he invaded and conquered much of Europe. But then the tide turned, and after a botched invasion of Russia in 1814, he was forced to resign and flee France. With the backing of the other major European powers, the exiled heir of the Capet dynasty, Louis XVIII, was installed as King of France. But a few months later, Napoleon successfully invaded Paris and reinstalled himself as emperor in what the French call the 100 Days. This triggered another period of European warfare, and Napoleon was defeated and exiled a second time, and Louis XVIII was installed as king a second time. The restoration of the Capet dynasty seemed like it marked a return to normal for France after the revolution, but there were still a lot of serious unresolved questions about what sort of political system France should have. King Louis died in 1824 and was replaced by his brother, King Charles X, but following a power struggle with Parliament and rioting in the streets, he was forced out in 1830. Parliament then appointed a new guy as king, Charles X's very distant and very liberal cousin, Louis Philippe I. Louis Philippe was the last king of France permanently, forever. His government is generally seen as a sort of pathetic last-ditch attempt to keep France as some kind of monarchy, even a very weak one. But by 1848, France was once again engulfed in political turmoil, and it was Louis Philippe's turn to resign and flee into exile. The parliament voted to end the monarchy a second time, triggering what we now call the beginning of the Second Republic. This republic was set up much more like the United States and much less like the crazy rule by committee system they had used the first time. So in 1848, France had its first ever presidential election. And guess who was elected as the first ever president of France? That's right, Napoleon III. Napoleon III was the first Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon II having died in the meantime. President Napoleon was very proud of his family legacy and wanted to copy his uncle as much as possible. So after a few years as president, he also declared himself Emperor of all of France in 1852. And like his uncle, Napoleon III was also into ill-conceived European wars. After leading France into a disastrous war with neighboring Prussia in 1870, he too was overthrown and fled into exile, becoming a bit of a theme now. The French Parliament then adopted a new constitution that introduced a new system of government under a more pure parliamentary system. From now on, the head of the government would be a prime minister, and the prime minister would be the head of whatever was the majority faction in the parliament. Alas, this proved to be a very acrimonious system. The French parliament of that time was horribly divided into all of these preposterous factions. You know, you had like extreme left-wingers, and then like super hardcore monarchists, and then like pro-Napoleon people, and then like ultra-fundamentalist Catholics, and Lord knows what else. This made it very difficult to cobble together anything resembling a majority coalition. As a result, for the next 7 decades, France had a different prime minister almost every single year. This is considered one of the most stable periods of French government. In June of 1940, France was conquered by Nazi Germany. To negotiate France's terms of surrender, the parliament appointed a guy named Marshal Pétain as emergency prime minister. Pétain had been a heroic military leader during the First World War, and a lot of people saw him as someone who could lead France during this time of crisis. Under the terms of the surrender deal, the Germans took control of Paris and all of northern France, while Petain's government was allowed to retain control of the southern half of the country. The capital of independent France was moved to the city of Vichy, and the government that followed is usually referred to as the Vichy regime. After the surrender, a lot of French politicians blamed their country's humiliating defeat on democracy, or a certain weakness in the national character. There became a lot of support for turning France into a fascist dictatorship of the sort that seemed to be having a lot of success elsewhere in Europe. So in 1940, the parliament voted to abolish democracy and turn Pétain into their very own fascist dictator. Today, Marshal Pétain is seen as one of the great villains of French history for his government's willingness to work within the Nazi-ruled European order. After the 1940 defeat, France tried to stay neutral for the remainder of the war, though a lot of historians would argue that Pétain was really just a German puppet who only had as much power as the Nazis were willing to give him at any particular time. After the Allied forces liberated Paris from the Nazis in 1944, a guy named Charles de Gaulle was installed as the interim leader of a new non-fascist government for France. De Gaulle was an army general who had fled France to oppose the Pétain regime from London, where he led a Allied-backed government in exile. He served as head of the temporary government for a year and a half, followed by 3 other men, until in 1947, France adopted a new democratic constitution. It wound up being a lot like the old pre-war one. They call this the Fourth Republic. This new government was once again set up as a pure parliamentary system, and it didn't take long for the old problems to come back and France to once again get into the habit of having a different prime minister every year. Then in 1958, France entered yet another period of intense political turmoil, this time provoked by an ill-fated war to hang on to their African colony of Algeria. It was an issue that was so divisive, there was actually fear that the French army might stage a military coup. As a compromise, the parliament decided to bring back old man de Gaulle, the great symbol of reconciliation after the Second World War. Hoping he could resolve the crisis, the parliament voted him in as prime minister and gave him all of these new powers. De Gaulle liked these powers and thought that France was best served when it had a single strong leader, like him, who was independent from the parliament. So shortly after becoming prime minister, de Gaulle proposed, and the French voters eventually approved, a new constitution in which the head of the government was a powerful president who was directly elected for a 5-year term. This became known as the Fifth Republic, and it is still the system that France uses today. President de Gaulle resigned in 1969, and Georges Pompidou was elected in his place. Then came Giscard d'Estaing, François Mitterrand, Jacques Chirac, Nicolas Sarkozy, Francois Hollande, and of course today, Emmanuel Macron. So there you go, the complete history of France told by regnal chronology. This was a pretty difficult video to make, only because I had to research so many different things and I tend to get kind of overwhelmed.